our curator, Emily Wilson.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming. I hope you can all hear me well. Yes. Great. So, thanks to Tom for his great introduction. It sort of gets you understanding the importance of this collection and what I'm going to be speaking on. I'd like to start this talk and sort of set the mood tonight with, I guess, what you could call a word painting from an anthropologist named Michael Taussig. And when you think about this, I want you to keep in mind these sets of images and the objects that you see around you when you think of this. Quote, "In a fanciful mood, we might wonder whether these be connected, the colors displayed on the bodies of the men on the one hand, and the semi-transparent dwelling places dotting the plains on the other. The teepee's quality of transparency being that from which all colors spring and into which they die away. With equal fancy, I want you to imagine what it might mean to sleep in shelter inside an animal this way, to be inside the buffalo, in this crucible of transparent color. This would make a nice complement to having wild animals inside your body. During the day, let us say, they live inside you. At night, you live inside them. Such is color." End quote. Here, Taussig brings up the idea of a symbiotic relationship and material connection that exists between bison and Indian, animal and man. But even more, he introduces color as the binding element between the two and a powerful medium through which we can visualize this relationship. Looking at Russell's artwork on the screen and in this gallery alongside many of the ethnographic objects he collected really brings home this connection between artist and object and between artwork and artifact and color. My talk tonight is about these relationships and the cultural products born from the varying ties that bind individuals, groups, and the natural world together. Plains Indian culture is steeped in the materiality of things and the sensory experiences that they impart. As an artist, and even more so as a sculptor, Russell harbored a deep understanding of and interest in material objects. His imagination fed off of the sensations of the body, imbibed as they were through the hand, eye, and mind. In assuming his Indian identity as Ah-Wa-Cous, or running antelope, Russell is, in a sense, performing through objects. His role play becomes an embodied appreciation of a culture he was drawn towards, a culture that valued the land, the wildlife, and tradition, and whose values, as such, were on display in their art, religion, and in the stories they tell about themselves. Within these culturally produced products, Russell found an escape from the bombardment of the modern world and the changes it wrought on the American West. A sculptor, he seized the landscape, molding the environment that surrounded him to create his own enchanted world, the West of Ah-Wa-Cous. Let's take a look at where Russell came from. So he was born in St. Louis, Missouri in 1864 to a wealthy family. At this time, St. Louis was still the most important port of trade and entry point into the Western territories, where mountain men, trappers, fur traders still roamed the streets. As a boy, Russell was raised on stories of the open range and the western frontier. His father, C.S. Russell, read adventure novels to him, such as Charles A. Forstick's popular Frank Nelson series and stories of Ned Buntline. He also recounted tales of Russell's great-uncles, Charles and William Bent, who were prominent in the early fur trade from 1820 to 1850. The figures of the frontiersman, fur trapper, and pioneer became typified in the American imagination by men like Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, and Kit Carson, whose resourcefulness, bold actions, success, and independent spirit propelled the settling of the West and advanced the frontier boundary. The frontiersman, fur trapper, and pioneer, in contrast, the Native American became their weighted counterbalance, receding from civilization's forward march into what was left of the primitive West. From the period of conquest to subjugation, the figure of the Indian transitioned from a hyper-present antagonist to a waning vestige of history, primitive and noble, yes, but ultimately feeble in the face of staggering losses in kin, land, and lifestyle, and one that could not survive the pressures of civilization, according to the frontier myth. These stories, legends, and myths of the frontier experiences that filled Russell's childhood stirred the young artist's imagination and conditioned his idea of what the American West was, the result of which was an inherited cultural predisposition to primitivism which outlasted the frontier. The sweeping changes that occurred at the turn of the 20th century triggered Russell's need to envision and actualize a new West that was steered by his attraction to the more primitive life. The philosophy and tradition inscribed within Plains Indian culture and storytelling drew Russell in and became manifest in his art and a part of his performative persona, effectively pulling him away from the anxieties of modern life and the changes wrought by it. Stretching from the late 19th century to the mid-20th century, the modern period was marked by rapid collective change driven by industrialization, urbanization, social fragmentation, and new technologies that disrupted long-standing social and economic patterns. It became characterized by contradictions between innovation and decay, the ephemeral and the enduring, and the stable and the contingent. This new epic ushered in a loss of certainty that left people disillusioned and alienated from the modern world as they tried to find stability and meaning between theoretically polarizing subjects, reason and faith, the natural and the supernatural, in their search for the re-enchantment of the modern world. In the context of the American West, the separation of God, man, and nature in popular ideology resulted in the era's impersonal relationship to the natural world, which almost destroyed both the land itself and the American Indian. Those who lived out west in the late 19th century witnessed the closing of the open range, the privatization of land, the subdual of Native American tribes, and the slaughter of wildlife, and felt its loss keenly. And many, like Russell, tried to hold on to and preserve the memory of the Old West as best they could. For them, the past stood tall. It became a stopgap against the shifting, uncertain present, and a yardstick against which to measure one's belief, philosophies, and moral character. Rather than limit him, Russell's embrace of the Old West awakened his imagination, allowing his creativity to blossom. His distaste for modern change led him in a common quest, as Michael Saylor argues, to seek, quote, underlying essences that could restore harmony, stability, and spirituality to a modern world that appeared increasingly fragmentary, transitory, and secular, unquote. As luck would have it, Russell's quest had begun early on in his life and found its mark in the American Indian. Plains Indian culture, religion, and philosophy were Russell's, quote, underlying essences that anchored him to the land, wildlife, cosmos, and the arts. These moorings were important touchstones for Russell's philosophical attraction toward primitivism, a belief in fate, and maintaining a spiritual harmony between man and nature. Not only did Russell seek out these by fostering friendships with Native people, visiting reservations, participating in ceremonies, collecting artifacts, and reading stories and histories, he also did it through psychological engagement. His performance of Indianness, achieved through gesture in sign talking, through costume in play acting, and through artistic representation in letters, paintings, and sculptures, offered him a form of escapism that allowed him to dwell in a possible world. So this act of playing Indian opened the door for Russell into worlds of enchantment, where reason becomes beholden to the imagination, and its designer and participants, as J.R.R. Tolkien professed, quote, seek shared enrichment, partners in making and delight, not slaves, unquote. There, in a world dressed in romance and nostalgia, Russell could inhabit the various personas and identities he crafted over the years. Kid Russell, the cowboy artist, Rawhide Rollins, an old-time raconteur, and Ah-Wa-Cous, or Antelope, the white Indian. While each of Russell's identities is distinct, they are similarly performed through the changes in speech, dialect, clothing, and gesture, and his pursuit of activities, atmospheres, and willing participants in play. Not only did he dwell within these possible worlds, once inside, he created art, enduring visual, literary, and journalistic manifestations of his enchanted world and those who dwelled within. Russell gravitated towards the Native American ideals that valued the health and integrity of the land and believed in humanity's role as a caretaker and steward rather than as a conqueror and owner. In embodying Ah-Wa-Cous, Russell was able to match his physical appearance with his philosophical views. Thus, playing Indian became a means to access the spiritual from the natural environment. Lake McDonald Valley, near the northern Rocky Mountains, is a landscape that easily lends itself to the imagination. Drawn to the area's primitive beauty and teeming wildlife, Russell bought a piece of property on Lake McDonald in 1905, where he built a cabin nicknamed Bullhead Lodge. Described as Russell as, quote, about as wild a place as you can find these days, unquote, Glacier's landscape was attractive because of its primitiveness and its history as a place of great spiritual importance to the Kootenai and Blackfoot tribes. As Russell biographer Dan Conway stated, quote, to this marvelous child of nature, the artist Russell, this was still the ghost country, and here too he went to make medicine. Here he sought and found favor of the Great Spirit to the end that he might successfully commune with nature's little ghost people, unquote. The impact that Bullhead Lodge had on the development of Charles Russell was profound. Its influence is not only superficially visible in the photographs of Russell as Ah-Wa-Cous, but deeply embedded in the artist's belief system, which was wed to the land. The sketch, Joe Among the Little People, from 1916, reflects the secondary world of enchantment that enveloped Russell and his protege, Joe DeYoung. It shows DeYoung squatting in Indian fashion while sign-talking. While the sketch fits within Russell's larger body of work that depicts figures from fictive worlds and historic tales, it is unusual in its observational character and the way it merges together fantasy and reality. In this role as observer, Russell is both artist and anthropologist, and the sketch becomes a visual record of the curious interaction and communion between DeYoung and the little ghost people. Like Russell's gnomes, the little ghost people, the above people, and the underwater people, and Nappy, were characters out of myth and folklore who lived among the animals and spirits. In Blackfeet mythology, Nappy, or Old Man, was chief over the animal people and bird people and spoke their languages, including sign talk. He is seen as a creator god and trickster character. Frank Bird Lindemann, author of Indian Wise Stories, which carries Russell's illustrations, describes Nappy as, quote, the strangest character in Indian folklore. Sometimes he appears as a god or creator, and again as a fool, thief, or a clown. He's a strange mixture of the fallible human and the powerful undergod. He made many mistakes, was seldom to be trusted, and his works and pranks run from the sublime to the ridiculous, unquote. Linguistically, the origin of Nappy is a compound word that joins Nina, man, and the particle api, or expression of color, which connotates the tint of early morning light or dawn. Taken together, Nappy, or man the color of dawn, can be understood as the material embodiment of Blackfoot spirituality. George Bird Grinnell understands this to mean that, quote, the original worship of the Blackfeet was the worship of light personified, unquote. Knowing this, we can view Russell's attraction to Nappy as an attraction to the philosophical underpinnings of Blackfoot religion and culture, and an attraction to the very light and color that animates Russell's canvases from the 1910s, when his use of color was at its most heightened. In the 19th century, the use and choice of color and dress signaled the divergent taste and appearance between civilized Europeans and uncivilized native people. In his 1810 treatise on color theory, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe noted, quote, savage nations, uneducated people, and children have a great predilection for vivid colors. People of refinement avoid vivid colors in their dress and the objects that are about them, and seem inclined to banish them altogether from their presence, unquote. While Russell's everyday dress resembled the muted tones of polite society, his wardrobe deviated from the norm by incorporating the colorful cincture sash. Russell stood apart in his affection for bright color, having once remarked, quote, men wear such drab clothes. Wish we could dress the way they used to in the old days. Bright colored coats with lace collars, knee breeches and shoes with big buckles on them, unquote. His signature look, the center sash bold red splash of color, set him apart from men of society who chiefly wore monochromatic, neutral-tone garments typical of the era. As Michael Taussig again argues, for many, the attitudes toward color derive from, quote, the Western experience of colonization as colored otherness, unquote. Bright colors and striking patterns close to the body were seen as repulsive because they were associated with indigenous peoples who were deemed primitive and close to a state of nature. These negative associations with color and indigenous dress were also prevalent in the American West, especially during the early reservation period when U.S. government policy mandated Native American assimilation. Recommendations by government agencies and boarding schools pushed for the adoption of civilized clothing to the detriment of traditional Native style. This noticeable loss was one that Russell lamented in a letter to Harry Stanford, saying, quote, the only real American don't use much style anymore. Once nature gave him everything he wanted. Now the agent gives him bib overalls and hooks his hand round plow handles and tells him it's a good thing to push along, unquote. While atypical for his time, Russell's predilection for vivid hues was a reaction against the mores and constraints of a modern society. Color for him became a bodily means of returning to tradition and to simpler times. As Ah-Wa-Cous, Russell could embody these ideals through the wearing of colorful Plains Indian garments. As illustrated in his letter to Harry Stanford, Russell understood the power clothing could convey for the wearer. Quote, the headdress is a good one. It's certainly a wild man's crest. I think our red brother stole his fashion from the animals and birds he knew. He saw the sage-cock dance and spread his tail feathers. That's where Mr. Injun got his dance bustle. He liked the war bonnet that the Canadian jay and kingfisher wore, so he made himself one, unquote. As described and illustrated by Russell, the headdress is a vibrant reminder of the body in motion, loaded up with animals and color. It is a visual reminder and a gestural evocation of the kingfisher's rattled song and the strutting vitality of the sage-grouse's dance, set to myth and mimicked by the steps of a dancer. Its suggestive power and sympathetic magic irreducible through modern manufacture. As witness and participant in religious ceremonies, powwows, and cultural events, Russell took in the colorful traditional clothing that was on special display and absorbed this new understanding of the body and its movement in Plains Indian dance, ritual, and activity. His own mimetic desire seems to gravitate towards the sensuosity of the act of being similar, which is grounded in the body, in gesture, in voice, bearing, and movement, and in the tactile. His transition into Ah-Wa-Cous required not only a psychological shift, but a physical transformation. A blonde-haired, blue-eyed white male, Russell was marked by characteristic European traits, but took pride in being described as a white Indian. He saw it as a compliment to his character, philosophy on life, and his strong, aquiline features. One reporter once described him as, quote, silent as his old comrades of teepee and hunting ground, pigeon-toed like the horseman of the plains, which he is, with high cheekbones and the searching gaze of a frontiersman and a hunter. Russell is as blond as a Viking, otherwise he bears a striking resemblance to old Chief Joseph, the famous warrior of the Northwest, unquote. The artist's colorful transformation into Ah-Wa-Cous required a dramatically different look, replete with its own set of clothing and signifiers. So this first layer of color was added to his skin. Theatrical makeup and grease paint were applied across his face and neck, deepening his fair complexion and darkening his ethnicity. The next layer of color was slipped over top his hair. Wigs made of black horsehair complemented his darkened skin. Simply styled, they hung in braids down the length of his chest and across his crown, or were twisted into a top knot that rested on his forehead. The final layer of color was wrapped across his body, swathing him in garments numerous and varied, from the simple undyed muslin cloth to the bright, bold patterns of cotton and wool to the painted bison robe or tanned hide, finishing off the artist's exotic look with the additions of accessories and prop artifacts. All the artifacts and garments that Russell wore in dressing as an Indian were purchased by him from native peoples or traders, given to him as gifts by friends, or made by himself. The artifacts he made are, in a sense, his own ethnographic art. Unlike the miniature models he made exclusively for his artwork, these pieces were scaled to a height in order to function as both artist props and personal accessories for his Indian costume. While modeled after traditional objects, Russell's works were fanciful creations that emulated the style and symbolism of traditional American Indian works rather than copy them outright. These artifacts hung on the walls inside of Russell's log cabin studio in Great Falls, substituting as decor, serving as visual aids, and actively used. Dan Conway again describes the setup in Russell's studio. Quote, "In the corner of his studio was arranged a miniature Indian lodge, which I learned that the artist had made himself. The history of a brave's life was painted on the walls of his teepee. On the floor of this little lodge lay a painted buffalo robe. To the left of the flap rested the saddle and pipe, and a backrest of peeled willows woven and hung on a tripod over which was thrown a colorful blanket." Unquote. When he was playing Indian and hosting guests, Russell made use of the artifacts, including a tobacco board in the collection. The board is decorated with 4-incised and painted figures at its corners: a black and white buffalo, a green, blue, and red thunderbird, a red and blue horse, and a red and black wolf or coyote. Like all of Russell's ethnographic art, these figures are executed in the style of painted hide and ledger drawings. On the board, Russell cut a mixture of plug tobacco, kinnikinnick, or leaf and bark mixture, and red willow bark, which was then packed into a pipe. In the passing of a pipe, he followed the traditional Blackfoot practice, as Conway explains again, quote, "Russell lights the pipe, holds it to the earth, to the sun, and to the 4 points of the wind. Then, lowering it to the ground, it is passed back in reverse order, and then down the other side. The pipe never passes the door." Unquote. This gesture of welcome and friendship can be seen in the photograph, too, of Russell and cowboy poet Wallace Coburn sitting together with their horses. Here, Coburn wears Russell's bonnet, buckskin jacket, and beaded necklace, while Russell dons a roach headpiece and a vest with his carved lance behind him, which was modeled after those designed for hunting bison. It is approximately 81 inches long, close to the range of typical Blackfeet lances, which measured 5 to 6 feet. Stamped Jukes Colson, the steel bayonet or beaver-tailed dag was circulated by the Hudson Bay Company during 1850 to the 1860s as part of the Buffalo Road trade. It is wrapped near the blade with animal fur. This practice was woven into Plains Indian mythology, which spoke to a man's ability to harness animal traits such as the swiftness of the otter or the power of the wolf, and transfer them into objects for the benefit of the wearer. Because religion and ritual were part of traditional hunts and warfare, warriors incorporated their own medicine or power into their weapons. Attached at the bottom of Russell's lance is his own personal medicine: an eagle's claw, red yarn, a braided scalp of horsehair, and a white and green beaded flannel tab with arrow designs. The lance's shaft is carved with figural and geometric designs, including depictions of the sun, a shield, and a human face reminiscent of Napi. A dancing figure in a trail headdress, a bird, a thunderbird, totem head, and a bear. In terms of symbolism, for example, in Plains Indian culture, the bear was a powerful symbol of strength and courage. Its depiction in Plains art was employed to heal the wounded and as a war medicine to enable warriors to defeat their enemies. So you can just see some of that there. And this is just a slide showing you Russell's signature as Ah-Wa-Cous that he signed to some of his illustrated letters. Here again, we see that what links Russell's object making and his role playing is the process through which gestures become sedimented in the body over time through habituated and repeated use of created objects and costumes. But perhaps the most published and recognized photograph of Russell in Indian attire is the image of him taken in a photograph studio around 1900, clothed in full regalia. Standing against a simple backdrop, Russell presents himself in three-quarter profile, wearing a serious expression, his cockeyed split bonnet headdress, beaded buckskin leather jacket, beaded leggings, and wrapped blanket around his waist with streaks of paint across his cheeks. This unusual split-horn bonnet headdress is a symbol of power and spiritual protection, characteristics associated with both the buffalo and the eagle. Together, these animals signify the dual properties of the heavens and earth, and both held spiritual significance for Plains Indian peoples. Peeking out through Russell's outfit, you can see, is a white cotton shirt and a buckle belt, the only signifiers of his civilized dress. This image calls to mind a newspaper reporter's description of the artist from 1919. Quote, "Long years among the Indians seem to have given his face the Indian characteristics. The Indian's set, unsmiling cast of countenance, the Indian's deep furrowed lines and steady, imperturbable look of the eyes, the Indian's smoothly brushed, evenly laid hair, are all his. His eyes are seldom in the present, and the same is true of his pictures." Unquote. The photographs of Russell taken in costume provide useful windows through which to examine the appearance and nature of his mimetic play. At a rudimentary level, Russell photographed himself and others dressed as Indians to help him visualize the figures in his paintings. Here we see Nancy and Russell dressed and posed in the first home in Great Falls around 1898. They are some of the earliest examples of Russell's use of personal photographs as a reference tool. In all but one, Russell is dressed in a simple breechcloth and straddles a saddle stand, striking poses that mimic the use of a bow and arrow, likely to be used in a painting of a buffalo hunt, which you can see that below. Later images taken of Russell in the front yard of his studio with Josie Wright, one of his native models, show Russell dressed in an older Blackfeet style, sporting a top-knot hairstyle, buckskin coat, and wrapped in a chief's blanket in one set of images, and the other a coyote and eagle feather turban with a capote jacket. However, unlike the action shots taken inside Russell's home, these images recall the stiff, formal poses struck in a 19th century portrait studio. They lack the camera's voyeuristic gaze that is present to a higher degree in images of Russell within the larger Montana landscape and in Bullhead Lodge. It is in Bullhead Lodge, in this discursive space, that we witness Russell as actor, bargaining for goods, hunting, reading animal tracks, and sign-talking. While Russell only knew a few words of Blackfoot and Cree, he was a knowledgeable and habitual user of Native American Sign Language in conversation and as a gesture of speech to convey emphasis or elicit clarity. As DeYoung described it, in Russell's capable hands, the language assumed an easy, windblown, quote, movement that took its cue from the falling clouds, an eddying leaf, moving water, wood smoke, and the play of light and shadow of an open fire. As a sign talker, Russell was all Indian, unquote. In playing Indian, Russell's choice of costume was influenced at least partially by the landscape he inhabited. The forests, lakes, and mountains of Glacier provided a dramatically different landscape for Russell than the plains and prairies of central Montana. The radical break in geography, coupled with the location's intended use as a summer retreat, helped to cultivate the character of Bullhead Lodge as a setting that encouraged freer movement, an open mind, and a willingness to experiment in staging opportunities for play. Built from a complex set of desires, the act of going native must also be interrogated in terms of its political and cultural impact. While one can inhabit the image of a racialized other, it is ultimately an impermanent identity, one that is just as comfortably worn as it is removed. As Sherry Hundorf argues, the practice has served as an essential means of, quote, constructing white identities, naturalizing the conquest of Native peoples, and inscribing various power relations within American culture, unquote. Its widespread practice during the late 19th century and early 20th century was not only initiated by individual enthusiasts, but also through youth organizations like the Woodcraft Indians and Campfire Girls, and adult fraternities such as the Improved Order of Red Men, which billed itself as a collective intent on preserving American history as keepers of Native American customs. In itself, Plain Indian could only act as a temporary moral solve to a systemic and underlying cultural unease that was symptomatic of the anxiety introduced by modernity and the historic record of brutality in the pursuit of both material wealth and moral superiority that built America. Russell and those like him were not immune to the complicities of his age and racial privilege in perpetuating and enforcing the dominant power structure. Environments like Russell's Bullhead Lodge and Glacier Park offered the artist a space of retreat from modern life that encouraged his imaginative play, as did his short visits on reservation to attend powwows and fed his interest in Native culture and history. While Russell was indeed cognizant and sympathetic to the struggles that the majority of Native Americans faced during his lifetime, he too fed into the mindset sometimes of them as a vanishing race. As one news reporter commented, quote, "Concerning the Indians of the West, Mr. Russell is not very optimistic. He says they cannot stand civilization and are slowly passing away. Under social restraint, they pine like wild animals in cages. The call of the wild is too strong with them to be resisted," unquote. For white America, the value of Native Americans and their culture lied in its historicity and in its past, not in its continuing present. Through the rule of experts, outsiders became the arbiters of Native American cultural authenticity and shaped the social narrative in history books and popular culture. Within this framework, Russell too acted as an arbiter of the authentic West and was complicit in maintaining the high value ascribed to Native American culture within a historic time period that correlated with traditional ways of life. But as to the photographs of Russell in Indian attire, looking at them elicits sensations within us and tied to our embodied experiences. These tactile images make the viewer aware of his or her own body as an organ of collective perceptions, lost in the textures, the senses, the flesh, and the histories and meanings associated with our experiences of place. Becoming embodied takes the abstract, the imagination and mental faculties, and renders them solid, grounding them in the physical world of concrete experience and tangible art. The practice of encapsulating ideas, beliefs, and spirituality into things is an old one. In Western European art, we see this in the tradition of making icons. Yet it proves only a temporary answer to the anxious dilemma of modernity, which sought to find a way to merge the heavenly and the earthly, and science and nature with religion. In many ways, Charles Russell became a cowboy because he could not live as an Indian. He once remarked in a letter to old-time cowpuncher Teddy Blue Abbott, quote, "I remember one day we were looking at buffalo carcass and you said, 'Russ, I wish I was a Sioux Injun 100 years ago.' And I said, 'Me too, Ted. There's a pair of us.' I have often made that wish since, and if the buffalo could come back tomorrow, I wouldn't be slow shed into a breechcloth. Like many I know, you're all Injun under the hide," unquote. Russell's longing to strip down to a breechcloth and ride freely across the western landscape is, as Philip Vine, the lawyer, describes, quote, "a longing for the utopian experience of being in between, of living in a paradoxical moment in which absolute liberty coexisted with the absolute. It was a quest for meaningful freedom and a contingent truth," unquote. Great Falls native LaRue Smith once noted, quote, "I have this suspicion that Russell may have been as great an entertainer as he was a painter, with his talents telling stories. This is an imponderable because his artwork lives on and his entertaining art died with him," unquote. I like to imagine that Russell thought of the American West, whether place or idea, as a world of possibilities and an elusive terrain, chimeric, shifting, subjunctive, expressed in language that exists outside of time, in imaginary situations, in wishes, hypotheticals, and conditions contrary to fact. A West, if it was real, that would be immediately identifiable by an attitude of possibility, exuded from both the artworks that describe it and the people who perform within it. Thank you.